This is a Tamiya VQS. This is the 2020 re-release of the Tamiya Vanquish, and I just built this, and I'm considering running it for the Classic class at the 2023 Vintage Off-Road Nationals. Before I get into the details that I have here for this car, I figured I'd go over a little bit how Classic works and some of the cars I've run in the past and how they've done for me. So the basic idea with Classic is we use plastic tub chassis, so anything that has a plastic tub chassis like a Tamiya Hornet, anything from that to like a Traxxas Red 2 or a Dirt Thrasher, a Manta Ray, or like a Tamiya Baja Champ. Those kinds of cars are what we focus on in the Classic class. And the whole idea is to have entry-level chassis to run for that class. But of course, because it's a racing class, people like me are going to try to engineer their way to a faster variant of these plastic tub chassis. So the extreme example of that would probably be what I ran last year here with the Kyosho Laser Alpha. Even though this is technically, you could say it's a Laser Alpha because it has a plastic tub chassis here, okay? The Laser Alpha has a lot of parts that are interchangeable with the ZXR, like the gearboxes, the suspension arms, everything essentially. So you can take that plastic chassis and just attach it to a ZXR and call it a Laser Alpha. And that's where it gets kind of dangerous to have the plastic tub chassis as the primary determinant of what is legal for the Classic class, because a car like this would be essentially too fast. I ran it anyway because at the time it was legal, and frankly, no matter what happened, I was probably going to win. But I really enjoyed running this car. It was fantastic. And if you go look at the racing videos I have for it from last year, you can see how nice the car ran. It was a really wonderful car to drive. But technically, at least going forward, this year, it's effectively not legal anymore because it's too modified. So that gets me back to either running my Dirt Thrasher, which I ran several times already, and it drives great. Wonderful car. But I've used it several times already, and I kind of want to try something new. So that's what gets me to the VQS, or trying my Traxxas Red 2 again. The last time I ran this, I think, was 2018 or 2019, and I had a lot of trouble with it because, among other things, I burned out the motor. So with the motor failing, I couldn't even run the main. But even before that, the car wasn't handling well because I had made setup assumptions about it, which were completely off base. I've learned a lot since then, so I think I've made corrections to this, which will certainly make it faster if I bring it back this year. So I'll probably bring both of these because I have space in the car. When I go out there, I'll just throw them both in the car. And I'll try this out during open practice and see how it goes. If it's fast enough and if I have enough fun with it, then I might just run that. Because this is actually more tunable than this car, even though this looks all fancy and shiny, and it's essentially a plastic tub egress. It's not as tunable as this car, but it's probably faster because it's four-wheel drive. And in this class, even though some people argue that two-wheel drive cars are just as fast as four-wheel drive cars when you put a sport-tuned motor in them, and partly because two-wheel drive cars are carrying less weight. I'm not convinced of that. Every experience I've had so far in this class tells me that the four-wheel drive cars are much punchier because you're applying power to all four wheels on acceleration. Your initial acceleration is going to be harder. Even though the car is a bit heavier, it's still a net win. So I tend towards the four-wheel drive cars. But if I can make this quick enough, I might just run it. The only thing that I can see working against this car is the fact that the bumper is way ahead of the leading edge of the tires. So that's going to affect the approach angle. But, you can kind of say the same here. With these wheels mounted, this bumper is way up front here. So this isn't really much better. And the other thing is the steering here. This is Ackerman steering. So these steering links connect directly to the servo saver. There's no bell crank or anything like that I can use to adjust steering geometry, like bump steer, for instance, or Ackerman or anything like that. So those are really the deficiencies of this chassis. But I can change roll center, camber gain. I can change anti-squat in this car. I can change toe end, shock angle. I can do all kinds of stuff. So that's kind of exciting. But going back to this is not as adjustable as the Rad 2 or the DF01, right? The Dirt Thrasher. This, if you put the Top Force Evo towers on it, you have a lot of options with shock angle and inner camber link placement front and rear, which makes it very fast. This one doesn't have that. All the camber link mounting points are essentially fixed. The inner camber link mounting point at the front is fixed. The outer camber link mounting point, you just have two mounting points on the front caster block, a high and a low, for high roll center and low roll center respectively. But, you know, that's it. There's no camber gain adjustment. There's nothing else. And then on the rear, there's effectively nothing. You know, you have the camber link mounting to the rear of the rear tower, and then to the single hole here on the rear hub carrier. There's no adjustments on either of the tower or the rear hub carrier. There's no spacers here that I can use to move the hub carrier in or out. There's nothing. It's all fixed geometry. If anything, maybe I can take this mounting point and mount it vertically toward the chassis, maybe, you know, drop down the mounting point a little bit, increase the rear roll center a little bit, but it's not going to change much. So even though it looks all sophisticated and fancy, there's really not a whole lot going on here that you can do for tuning the car for racing. So that, if anything, makes it a bit more thematically consistent with what we're trying to achieve with the classic class. And so even though it looks fancy, it's really not a great car, but it might still drive well. It could be that the native geometry of the car is still very good, and it could still end up driving well. Anyway, enough rambling about that. What have I actually done to this? The build is mostly stock. I didn't change the screws or anything like that. You know, usually like I'll take a car like this or the Manta Ray and I'll swap out the steel screws for titanium or aluminum screws. I didn't do that here. All I did was try to beef up the areas that I felt could be beefed up. So the major weakness of the VQS, as I understand it, is this I think it's G10, G11. This G11 part, which is this plate here that mounts around the rear gearbox. On the Egress and the Avanti 2001, this plate here is part of the chassis, if I remember correctly. Here, because the VQS is a plastic tub chassis, this is a separate plastic part. I don't have it with me right now. and it apparently it has some weak spots to it. So RC Evo Logic makes an aluminum version of that. So that gets rid of that problem. I don't have to worry about that breaking. The front and rear towers, as you can see, are aluminum. Those are made by Extra Speed. Same thing for the front bulkhead. That's aluminum. Normally, I would tend to avoid running aluminum parts on cars like this because all you're doing is transferring the force of a collision to something else. But I figured for this, the way the towers mount, maybe it's a good idea to use aluminum towers. And it's not like the rear tower is mounting to this, you know, aluminum plate here. So what's going to break? Probably nothing. If anything, I'm just making the rear stronger. As for the front, this front tower mounts onto, I think it's like part of the front gearbox here, right? This guy right here. This seems strong enough. I'm not too worried about it breaking, that mounting point breaking. So I figured I'd just put the stronger tower on there to keep the tower from breaking. So that's pretty much it for the aluminum parts. The Extra Speed also makes aluminum parts for the steering bell crank, although I'm still using the original plastic parts there for now. Partly because the way that the aluminum steering rack mounts, you get, I think they're 4x8 bearings, and so the inner diameter there of that bearing is 4 millimeters, but you got 3 millimeter screws here to mount through the steering rack into the chassis. So it does mount a little bit differently than how it mounts on the Egress or the Avanti 2001 or the Avanti. So I'm leaving the aluminum rack out for now, although I could probably get some sleeves. I think like in this there's some sleeves in here that I could use to pick up that 1 millimeter gap. But anyway, I'll put that aside for the time being. Other aluminum parts, which I've done many times on other Avanti-like or Egress-like builds, is the Yeah Racing front steering knuckle. So this part here that mounts over and down around the caster block, this little lip here that goes, man, it's really hard to see. Okay, now it's focusing. The steering knuckle goes up like this and then back like this. This plastic part here tends to break along this ear. So I always like to get the aluminum upgrade for this, again, by Racing. That'll make it stronger. And then for the rear, I just get the rear the rear hub carrier. Just because, really, I don't think running the plastic one will be much of a risk. But I just get the aluminum one anyway. I don't have a really solid justification for that. But for the other parts, especially the steering block and this G11 upgrade part, those are probably the most important aluminum parts you would get. And perhaps the bulkhead here. As you can see, because this is aluminum, chances are if I hit something hard, then I'm probably going to break the arm or maybe break the rear mounting point for the arm. That's one thing that I'm not too crazy about with these chassis, is the back side of the arm mounts on this little thing that's an attachment that's part of the front gearbox. So that's another spot that theoretically might break. I don't have enough running experience with these cars, honestly, to actually see if that piece will break off. So we'll see. And this, this front bumper is pretty wide anyway, so I'm not too worried about it. What other modifications or upgrades did I do? I put in the torque splitter set, so that comes with options for converting the center ball diff to either a one-way or a locked unit. So I converted that to a locked center spur gear. So that way there's no one-way, it's just full-time four-wheel drive. And it also comes with ball diffs front and rear. So I put ball diffs in instead of the planetary gear diffs that come with the kit. The ball diffs will be lighter, there's just less metal in there. So that'll save a bit of weight, even though I'm adding weight with aluminum shocks and aluminum towers and everything else. And of course we have the high cap dampers. Probably don't need these. The stock dampers are perfectly fine, and they have a similar kind of a seal arrangement. I think it's a single bushing with a single O-ring in the seal for both the high cap dampers and the kit dampers. But for the kit dampers, those parts all come off of a parts tree. Here, the shock bushing, I think it's machined, so it's probably just better tolerance. You'll get better sealing of the oil. Although, to be fair, when I ran the kit shocks on this DF01 for a while, they were perfectly fine as well. So you don't really need the high cap dampers. I just got it because they look cool, if I'm perfectly honest with myself. But what did I run inside? I have 3-hole pistons, front and rear. Those come from the parts tree. And I use 45 weight oil, front and rear, low-C 45 weight oil. These do pretty nicely with the drop test. There's no extra preload on the shocks or anything. Okay. So I don't have to really push this down in order to get the front to not slap the ground from the drop test. So it seems okay. What else do I have? Because we're running a sport tune motor, I got to use a DC speed control. This is a Novak Duster 2 that I happen to have lying around, and that is paired with a LiPo cutoff. If you go watch one of the videos I made for the Laser Alpha, I talk about how to set up a LiPo cutoff on your old DC speed controls without spending a bunch of money on like the old Novak LiPo cutoffs that are very rare. There's much cheaper options for doing it that are just as effective, so you can go check that out. Let's see, the other thing I did here, the actual setup chains that I made was on the steering here. So the way that the steering geometry is from the box setup, so if you assemble it per the kit instructions, what ends up happening is you have this little guy here. So you have this rod end that goes on this side, and this ball stud that mounts on the bottom, and there's a lock nut that locks into this from the top. And there's just enough thread on this guy to get to the end of the lock nut. That means, even though this is mounted vertically, and theoretically you could put spacers in here to move this up and down to change your bump steer, there's not enough thread on this guy here to allow you to do that while keeping the lock nut intact with this ball stud to keep it locked down. So I took this back off and I went to a Kyosho style ball stud on the inside. This is just a 4.8 millimeter ball stud. That's it's the kind that you thread an actual screw through. This particular one is a red aluminum one by 3 Racing. So I have that with a 3 millimeter screw and a bunch of spacers here. I think it's maybe about 5 millimeters or so of spacers here, just to push this down. Because what you'll find is if you don't do that and you have the stock setup, there's quite a bit of bump steer. And that kind of makes the car behave very strangely as you're bumping around on track. So I personally prefer just a neutral bump steer setup, so 0 bump steer. And because the inner ball stud here is mounting on the bottom of the steering plate, and this outer ball stud here is on the top, at full compression, this ball stud's low, this one's high, and they're far enough away from each other that that's going to essentially, if I remember correctly, when you press this up, this is going to turn in. So actually what's happening is as you bring the suspension up, this link levels out, and that's going to push the steering knuckle out, and that's going to make this wheel point inwards. So what you actually want to do is put spacers under the inside here so that at full compression this ball stud is further away, and that's going to pull this back in, and that'll help to straighten the wheel out. It's not perfectly 0 bump steer, but it's pretty close. So just, play games here with how many spacers you need to get this just right, and you can get neutral bump steer. So that's the only setup change I made. But that's kind of it. I'm really looking forward to trying this. It is kind of heavy, fully loaded. It feels heavier definitely than either of these two cars, especially this one. This is pretty light. So that could be one thing that slows it down. It'll definitely make the motor run hot. So I have a heatsink here. Maybe there's enough room to mount a fan in there. I'm not completely sure. So we'll see. The way the track surface is this year, they added glue to the dirt, so it's going to be higher grip. So combine higher grip with a heavier car, this motor could end up running very hot. So I'm a little worried about that. If this is too hot, then I might have no choice but to go to the Rad 2 because there's space here to actually mount a fan above the motor here and really cool the motor down. I'll have to play around inside this to see if there's a way that I can do that. I might have to certainly open up, this vent here to get more cool air in. So we'll see. But I'm looking forward to this. It seems like a cool car. Reflecting on this a little bit, I hate to go off on a tangent, but some of the first videos I made were of my Avanti 2011 re-release. This was way back in 2011. I've since sold that car off, but it is kind of nice to return to this platform because at that time, I felt like I couldn't quite get that car to work the way I wanted to. Part of it was because I was still new to racing at the time and I didn't really understand how to make good setup changes to a car. So, if I had that car today, I could probably make it run a lot better. But even still, I always wanted to try an egress. The egress was kind of a better version of the Avanti, longer wheelbase. The front suspension was a bit better. So I always wanted to try that, but I never had a chance. Because in the four-wheel drive classes, things like the XX4, the YZ10 were way better cars. And the egress would end up in that class because it has a carbon fiber chassis. The VQS, or the Vanquish, because it's plastic tub, it can run in the classic class, and that's a much more appropriate class for this kind of a chassis that isn't really great for the full-on four-wheel drive class. So I'm really excited to at least try it out this year and see how it goes. So as far as, it'll either be this or the Rad 2 for the actual qualifiers and mains. But we'll see what happens. So that's it for now. Thanks for watching.